Hi, I'm Joanne Langham. I'm going to take you through the first part of Week 2 workshop for Principles of Entrepreneurship. This week we are looking at entrepreneurial opportunities and the entrepreneurial process, specifically looking at creativity and recognising opportunities. You can see our details here for both Sorel and my contacts. You are best to contact me through email if you'd like to get hold of me. So before we begin this session, just a little bit of a recap from last week, which is where we started looking at teams and their roles in innovation and in entrepreneurial success. We expect you to try to pull together your team by next week, if possible. We have done a few activities in our class sessions, but if you're still struggling to get yourself into a team, please let me know, and next week I'll help allocate you into a team. You are able to use the link provided in the slides here to be able to register your name into a team and also register the rest of the members in your team. Please try to make sure that you include your full name as registered at the university, as well as your student number. So just a quick recap on where we're at. So the first part of the semester, we'll be looking at the entrepreneurial process, innovation, creativity, and how to actually do the work of an entrepreneur. The second part of semester, we will be looking at pitching. You'll get the opportunity to pitch in your teams, your ideas, and actually apply some of the knowledge that you've gained in the first part of semester. So as I said last week, we looked at teams, the roles of teams in the success of the entrepreneurial process. And this week we're going to look at generating ideas and identifying the opportunities for your business. So today we are going to focus on creativity and the very important process of being able to generate ideas. I used to think of creativity as basically being this sort of magical, mystical thing that happened and that only geniuses could be someone who had the talent and the ability to be creative. I thought it was something that, and I think a lot of people think it is, that it's something that you're born with, it's inherent, it's a talent. But it's not necessarily that. This is how generally most people think of what it is to be creative.
Before we were using Monday.com, our team was drowning. Our days used to split between work . There are people who talk about the creative process with such humility. You know, there's a sense that something larger than yourself has worked its way through you. To paraphrase Khalil Gibran's notion about children, the creative process, creativity comes through you, but not from you, though it is with you. It belongs not to you. Right? You know, this notion that we are the frontal lobes of the universe. So when we utter inspiration, what are we actually doing? Are we creating something that isn't there, or are we merely transcribing, right? The notion of inspiration means we're breathing in and exhaling what we've taken in. So we're merely transcribing the observation of what is. We're reporting. We are all cosmic cycles. And the creative process is merely what we brought back as reporters of the numinous. When we go to Plato's realm of ideals, we are as navigators. We are as Dorothy going to Oz, seeing the world through a different lens, seeing reality through a different operating system, a different set of filters, and thus being able to read it different, to see something that others can't, and then bring that back, and then share that. I think that that's what's happening during creativity. That's why we should be humble, respect the gods. There's poetry in every moment.
So that's basically how I know I saw creativity until I started actually researching and trying to look into what was actually happening with creativity. And I learned that you could teach people. You could teach people to draw, people who had never had a talent in being artistic. And that, in fact, these talents were something that some people thought were on the right side of the brain, that you could actually dip into the brain and be able to trigger some form of creativity. Well, that was a bit of a revelation at the time. And I was intrigued with the concept that creativity actually sat in one part of the brain. And these were things that really inspired me and really made me curious about how the brain worked. But since then, I have actually learned that that isn't true, that these things are not, they're basically narratives that have been made up about creativity, that creativity actually has some very strong grounding in science. And creativity is, in fact, a function of just being human. And we all have the inherent ability to be creative. Creativity is critical to our way of thinking as humans. So my research took me into understanding the science of creativity and what causes that moment of creative insight, the point of inspiration where a number of things come together and we make that cognitive leap about some new idea or some new thing that we're trying to invent, a problem we're trying to solve, or a challenge we're trying to overcome. I started researching everything that I knew about the psychology of creativity, and I very quickly learned that there were many opinions and conflicting views about how or why we were creative, and particularly the historical side of creativity has a wide variety of views on how and why creativity occurs. So creativity was originally believed to be a social function, something that people believed was actually developed out of the factors, psychological factors such as childhood behaviour or experiences, that there were potentially biological characteristics. And there are many variations on this, including evolutionary psychology. People talk about a flow state, and that there's lots of different forms of motivation for creativity, various rationale, etc. And some of the theories, particularly the historical ones, are things like Wallace's theory of creativity, which was developed back in 1926. Other theories followed after this, and particularly after the cognitive revolution, including Guilford's structure of intellect model, which was very much around identifying intelligence. And this is one of the theories that actually brought us divergent and convergent thinking, which is a core aspect of many of our design practices today, and also as a core of our thinking around creativity. There were also other things developed during this time, like Torrans's test of creative thinking, which is a psychological test to be able to assess whether you have creative capability. Most of these theories around creativity, however, revolve around an observation of a behaviour or actions of people. And they didn't really look into what was actually occurring in the brain to make this happen. So the research into cognitive psychology and neuroscience has actually brought us closer to really understanding how creativity occurs, what actually happens when someone creates a new idea. We've since learnt that creativity has a function in neuroscience. To understand how creativity happens in the brain, you have to really understand the functions of the brain. And the brain at its simplest form is really just a pattern recognition system. That is, it's used for prediction and to decrease uncertainty. This is really to enable us to function and maneuver, make sense of the complexity of the everyday world. Our brain is constantly running multiple predictive scenarios about everything that could possibly happen around us. There are many other things that come together to help our brain work the way that it does. So there are things also like our vision, which enables us to draw connections and help us make sense of the world. And we see things that are there that are not necessarily reality. So here, for example, you may see a Dalmatian in this picture or not. Some people claim to see an elephant. And these aren't actually there. They're just the way that the brain makes sense of the information that is there. And this is an example of the Gestalt principle, where we see objects due to the similarity and we perceive structures and patterns in the information. Another example is how many black dots you can see in this picture here. Well, despite what your eyes are actually telling you, there are no black dots. There are only white dots that appear to darken in the periphery of your vision. And this is an example of the scintillating grid illusion, another tool around our vision that our brain uses to help us make sense of the world. So our brain uses a bunch of assumptions, shortcuts, and stereotypes so that we can function in our complex world. But it also means that because of this, we have a huge amount of biases. And there is a whole area of psychology, or also in economic psychology, known as behavioral economics, which is dedicated to the understanding of cognitive bias and how this is used to influence human behavior. Simply, there are basically two modes of thinking. System one, which is our fast and immediate way of dealing with the world around us. So we do things on instinct in system one. And then we have our slow mode, system two, which is a more deliberative type of process where our brain actually thinks through and assesses the information more thoroughly when making decisions. So these are the two systems that operate around our brain, and they, of course, then give us biases because of the way that it operates. So there are a lot of elements, a lot of study, there's a lot of research that's gone into creativity, but probably the most important elements that we need to be aware of when we're studying creativity are these 6 points about how the brain works. So the first one is that we know that the brain does not just operate, creativity does not just occur in one part of the brain, it's actually a whole of brain activity. There is no such thing as a left and right brain distinction when it comes to this type of thing. Our brain is also a very sophisticated pattern recognition system, which I've just mentioned. It uses something called like an advanced scaffolding to bridge connections between thoughts, perceptions, and concepts to actually help us think. This is uniquely human. We are the only ones, the only animals that do this. The third one is memory. Memory is actually a function of prediction. It helps us respond to the future. We use the past to shape our future. Number 4 is the use of metaphors or analogies to help us think and solve problems. So things such as fables, stories, and narratives are actually how our brains use a template of a situation over here, and then they apply it to a new problem over there. And this is something that is primarily seen in humans. It is observed in some animals like chimpanzees only while they're very young and learning to develop. And point 5, so because our brain uses memory to help us predict the future and prepare responses for the future actions, the greater the exposure that we have to different experiences, people, ideas, then the more opportunities we have for creative connections. So that's number 5. And number 6, finally, creativity is more likely to happen when we feel safe and happy. It's basically if we trigger our animal brain or the system 1 thinking, we trigger a mode for survival. So what we want is to be in the state of happiness, or we're not fearing anything, and therefore we will stay in systems 2, which will enable creativity to occur. So what is creativity then? Common definitions tell us various different things about bringing something new into existence. Unfortunately, that doesn't really give us a very clear picture of what creativity is. Creativity is actually a relatively modern concept. Our ancestors thought of creativity in terms of things like a genius, that it was about talent, as I've mentioned, invention, discovery, imagination. These terms and their meaning have particular connections to social, political, and economic conditions of different times in history. However, the first use of the word creativity came into being in 1875 in relation to Shakespeare's works, and in particular one work, and it was described as poetic creativity. And this changed its meaning from being the act of creating to being a word describing a trait or a phenomenon. A great deal of research still centres, however, around what we consider to be the 2 core concepts relating to creativity, which is novelty or originality and value or appropriateness. And this is how it's primarily defined now in academia. So where do new ideas come from? How do people create something new? Well, there's a number of ways to look at this process, and I particularly like Arthur Koestler's explanation of it. And he describes it as a process of bisociation. So Koestler believed that the new way ideas are formed is through a recombination of ideas in different ways, rather than association, which is the connection of ideas related around a topic or a theme, which is how our brain stores it. Bisociation is conceptually combining new ideas in a different manner to come up with something new. And this is shown in the diagram here as being on a different plane of thinking, or as 2 different paradigms that intersect in a perpendicular manner. Of course, this is just a conceptual way of thinking about it, but it gives us a way of unpacking and understanding the creative process. So here are some examples of how this works. What do you get, for example, if you combine a phone with a satellite? You get GPS maps or tracking. A phone with shopping or online shopping, you will get online shopping or deliveries. Saving with banking with time, so automated banking, or a phone with, say, something like satellite film and shopping, you get Netflix. So this is how our brain actually works to develop new ideas. So I'm now going to swap over into our new activity that we did in class, and so when some people appear to come up with ideas as if by magic or by some kind of genius, it is actually not the case. It comes down to a range of factors that have been, in fact, priming us or priming the mind to be in a space where the right connections and combinations of thoughts can come together to give you a new idea. So here are some examples of where obvious new ideas have been created from existing concepts. In the late 2007, in San Francisco, Airbnb was born. I think we're all fairly familiar by now with Airbnb. Airbnb founders Brian Chesky and Joe Gebbia had just moved from New York to San Francisco without employment. They were actually having trouble paying their rent and were looking for a way to make some extra money. They noticed that all the hotel rooms in the city were booked, as there was a local industrial design conference which attracted a huge number of visitors. And the youngsters saw an opportunity here. They bought a few airbeds and quickly put up a site called Air Bed and Breakfast. The idea was to offer visitors a place to sleep and to have breakfast in the morning. They charged $80 each a night, and the idea succeeded, and the first Airbnb guests were born, which included a 30-year-old Indian man, a 35-year-old woman from Boston, and a 45-year-old father of four from Utah, all sleeping on these two guys' floor. The inspiration for Uber, which is the second example, came when Travis Kalanick and Garrett Camp found themselves stuck in Paris on a snowy evening, unable to find a taxi. They asked themselves, what if you could request a ride simply by tapping your phone? The company first launched in 2009 and have been growing ever since. Airbnb was a concept created out of the idea or the concept of booking accommodation with locals, and Uber was a combination of taxis and local drivers. And these are ideas that came from needs, knowledge, and ideas at a time to solve a particular problem. So I'd like to remind you here probably of some other material that is available on Blackboard, and particularly a video that I have provided there around creativity and the creative process. I just wanted to remind you about the core part of the ideation process that I've mentioned, which is about the divergent and convergent thinking process. Ideation requires the ability to expand our thinking process and allow ideas to flow. This requires imagination, but it also requires the freedom to be imaginative without judgment, self-judgment, or the judgment of others. Divergent thinking requires us to explore options and run scenarios that might provide a different perspective on a situation. When all of those ideas are extracted, we then start to combine ideas, evaluate and prioritize concepts. The most common way to do this kind of thing is with brainstorming. Brainstorming, in its broadest sense, is a process of trying to quickly generate as many ideas as possible in a short amount of time. By rapidly putting down as many ideas as possible, people exhaust the most obvious and heuristic ideas first, and then they move on to the less common and more radical ideas as they are pushed beyond the brain's tested limits. Good brainstorming pushes people into the uncomfortable thinking zone, and then will also use other techniques to help stimulate ideas or challenge the brain's natural biases. After we've done that, we then return to the convergent side of brainstorming, where we start to narrow down our ideas and then select ultimately a few ideas to actually test or prototype. The most common way to do brainstorming is face-to-face in a workshop usually, and the process is to ask each person to generate as many ideas as possible in a short period of time, often asking them to focus on an area or a problem space. We may also ask people to reframe a problem that they're looking for solutions rather than dealing with the problem itself. So, for example, you might challenge participants by asking them to come up with ideas based on how Google might solve it, or how would you solve this problem if you only had $100? These types of frames help change how the brain connects the ideas or the different pieces of information to create a new idea. After all of the ideas are exhausted, ideas are shared and people are asked to build on other people's ideas. And this brings all of the different people's perspectives to the original ideas and helps make new and unexpected connections. And there are many variations on this process, but this is really the core of what it means to brainstorm. So here we have a number of key creative group processes. I've already just mentioned the direct ideation process around brainstorming, but there's also brainwriting, brainstorming, cheat storming, and chain storming, which are all just variations of this process with different ways of framing aspects and stopping and starting points in the process. We also have improvisation, which is a creative process that's usually done physically, either in theatre or maybe conducted with musicians, say like in the jazz picture we have here, where people are basically building on what other people are doing right in the moment. We also have visualization, which is a way of getting people to take what they're thinking and putting it down, sharing it, and physically drawing their ideas. And by doing this, you're able to tell a story, use narrative, and have other people build on those ideas. Strategic play, such as Lego serious play, is a great method. It uses kinesthetics to actually engage the creative process. We have creative innovation games, such as game storming, which is basically a combination of several of the above activities, usually facilitated. There is also a known methodology called TRIZ, which was developed by a Russian researcher, an academic, and he did research into understanding what sat behind patents, the ideas that sat behind patents. And after researching a vast number of patents, he discovered that there were basically 50 contradictions or 52 contradictions that sat behind most patents, or the solutions available in most patents. And these sorts of contradictions were things like the solution was lightweight, but also strong. And these have been mapped and can be used to help trigger creativity when reviewing and matching against the contradiction map. There's also a number of other tools that are available, such as reframing and thinking tools like Scamper. We have Edward de Bono's 6 thinking hats, lateral thinking, parallel thinking, and then other things such as open source or crowdsourcing for open innovation. So these are all different ways that we can stimulate creativity and creative thinking in groups. However, creativity can often go wrong in group processes. And even though we think it sounds pretty straightforward, it's actually not as simple as it looks. And unless you have a trained facilitator to run these types of activities, or that you understand these things that can occur, the problems that can occur in group processes, they can actually go wrong. There are a number of thinking biases that actually occur with brainstorming, and these are caused by factors such as dominant personalities who overtake and lead the group and potentially down the wrong path. We have factors like groupthink, so cognitive biases that basically lead us to work together as a group, but also start to think like a group, which means we don't get the diversity of thinking that we need. Self-censorship or self-evaluation bias, social loafing or free riding, so where people don't actually contribute original thinking to the group and they actually rely on others to do the work in the group. So we have to be really careful about when we're conducting these group creative processes that we understand what is occurring and we're actually observing and understanding the group dynamics to make sure these types of things don't occur. So good brainstorming, however, requires a well-defined problem, understanding of the situation, diversity in participants, and generally good facilitation. Creativity is basically an essential ingredient for any kind of new idea development or for any innovation. I'd like to just finish off today's session by bringing you back to the statement that I made at the beginning of the session, which was about the fact that creativity is not something that is an inherent personality trait or something that you're born with, or something that only people with talent and particular genius can do. In fact, it's something that we all are capable of. Research conducted by, I'm not going to try and pronounce his name, but his details are at the bottom of the screen there, was conducted many years ago, and over a period of about 5 years, he interviewed over 90 people of what would be considered to be exceptional creativity, genius, making innovations, discoveries, etc., that were groundbreaking. And these people all had a variety of different personality traits. The most important thing that he noted about these people and their creativity was that they had complex personalities, and that creative people generally have a lot of contradictory natures. So they can be both an introvert and an extrovert, depending on the situation, that they're fun-loving and they're hard workers. They're humble, but also proud. They're ambitious, but selfless. And they have a lot of these contradictory aspects. And that's because they're all very different, and they apply different personality traits or different characteristics in different situations. The reality is that we are all capable of creativity. And I just like to reinforce that for everyone taking this course, because you are all potentially creative people and all capable of becoming innovators and entrepreneurs. I hope you enjoyed the session. Thank you.